So I only met Djuke during the presentation of this day, and it's been a great pleasure. Djuke Veldhuis, rightly pronounced, has a PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge. Following her degree, she explored the world of science, journalism, and communication, working for New Scientists, and continues to be involved internationally in science communication-related work for the British Council and US Global Development Lab. She came to Aarhus in 2014 on a Marie Curie co-found fellowship and is currently based at the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies. And Djuke is going to tell us a lot about cortisol measurements, the trials and tribulations of measuring stress and anxiety in the field. Please, Djuke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen Johanna. What I really seek to do here is a lot of, we've just had some examples from people working in labs. There are obviously a lot of data coming out of medical centers, but my research has really been focused in measuring stress and anxiety in really remote locations, which brings with it its own challenges, particularly in terms of sample collection, but also storage. How do you go about analyzing data? And when you're dealing with people, people are essentially incredibly difficult. There is probably a reason why in addition to my human projects, I'm currently doing a project on the effects of temperature stress on mate choice in fruit flies, because they are very much simpler, of course, to work with, and it can be quite stressful, forgive the pun, working with humans. There are many difficulties measuring stress in the fields, and I think I would just like to sum them up for you here. I'm hoping there's going to be sound in this as well. There's no sound. Hang on. Bear with. Hang on. It's worth it. I promise. Here we go. This basically sums up what I'm trying to deal with most of the time. Oh, come on, William. That's a shame. There's always something in technology, isn't there? Never mind. It was worth it, but I'll see what I can show it to you later. My inspirations for my research really came from the early field research, from the early field studies that were done, and these themselves were based and supported by the foundation work that Cannon and Celia set up. Fun fact, the only reason Hans got involved in stress research is because he was so incompetent at handling his rats that he spent most of his time chasing them around the lab, as opposed to his students who could handle the rats. And one of the things he noticed, that all the experiments a student had been involved in, these rats weren't suffering from ulcers, but the experiments he was running, they did have ulcers. Initially he was testing for completely different things, so it's serendipity in science. But really what you see in the 1960s and 70s, you are beginning to see the early work on people going out into the field and seeing what can we measure in sort of real world populations. And this concept takes off in anthropology, and people are, Baker and Little in particular, set off to look at the adaptive limits of human survival. You know, how do people living, for example, in high altitude do this? What are some of the effects? And with these studies came the realization that adaptation was usually the result of multi-stress environments. As people move on, they go from extreme environments to looking at what, for example, is happening within different migrant groups to new countries. How are people adjusting? What is the effect of not only the environment but also culture, the culture on these different groups? There are longitudinal studies which very clearly begin to show the effects, for example, of lifestyle incongruity, where the effects of modernization can be predicted by changing blood pressure, obesity, and in this case, stress hormone levels as well. while this is developing in biological anthropology and sort of medical anthropology, there are corresponding developments in psychology where people start looking at general scales to try and look cross-culturally at how are people tackling these things. So, in a nutshell, this was the setup that I had in my mind. Slightly idealistic perhaps, but going into the field research, I was aware that there are, obviously you've got the environment, you've got your genetics, you've got your demographic variables, and I thought, well, how hard can it be to not only measure these, but also get some measures of stress in general. And I mean, there's good basis for doing this. For example, if we're looking here at the stress bootcamp, I've just picked up some data of traumatic events and PTSD. You can look at all sorts of things cross-culturally and see some quite marked patterns, some of which are cross-culturally compatible, others less so. But for example, the effects of robbery and theft in different populations, how often that is likely to result in post-traumatic stress, the effects of sexual or physical abuse. There's huge variation along populations, but in general, you can, once you know a certain series of trends, there is fairly marked stability across these different populations. Now, my fieldwork was based in Papua New Guinea. More pointedly, Papua New Guinea is one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse places on the planet. And there was a good reason for going, that was one of the main reasons for going there. I was really interested to see, in such a culturally diverse place where change is happening so quickly, you know, how do people deal with this behaviorally? Not only that, so all of this area is in the Pacific Ring of Fire, so when you do have underground earthquakes, the chance of tsunamis are really devastating. You've got a lot of island populations. The one I was working on is called New Ireland, which is based here. And New Britain, which is based here, no colonial overtones whatsoever, is volcanic as well, so that erupts every now and then. You've got people living subsistence style lifestyles, but undergoing very rapid change. This is the Irian Jaya Peninsula along the border with Indonesia, is where in the 1970s they are still finding populations literally in the Stone Age. And where, you know, the pidgin English for helicopters, a helicopter, for example, is white Jesus flying machine and things like that as they translate. You know, these populations within the space of a few generations have gone from subsistence economies to, for example, having much more access to processed food and are making transitions to monetary economies. One thing you see here is that on the surface you see paradise, but underneath there's a lot more going on. And mine was the first field work to go out there and assess stress hormone levels in the field. The reason for giving this background is because the inevitable challenges will become self-evident here. So there's one road on the island that runs the Bulominsky Highway. This is by this time the Germans have taken over and they built this one highway which runs this way. At its extreme, there's only 10 to 40 kilometers from one side of the island to the other, but there's this big mountainous chain, 2,000 meters high, which cuts through that. The administrative capital is here. Then about an hour and a half, 2 hours drive again way, you get to Lemekot, which was my first study site, but then the road gets worse and worse and worse. So then you get to Bol, which is my most traditional village that I was working in. And even though it is closer to the administrative capital, it's more traditional because my other village called Kimadan was based next to a health center. Now when I say villages, I mean places without sanitation, without running water. If there is any electricity, they're propane powered gas tanks and similar and things like that. The only place of any that had more than a couple of hours of electricity permanently was Lemekot. So one of the logic was to survey human responses to stresses in New Ireland and assess the consequences on health and well-being to hopefully promote our understanding of the biological basis of human adaptation. one thing I should note is that in addition to being in the Pacific Ring of Fire, this region ranks at the lowest quartiles for literacy, incredibly high rates of HIV and AIDS, something I will come back to, a very high infant mortality and weak government. So there are lots of different factors going on to consider. The hypothesis and my research questions are less relevant because I really want to get into the practicalities of doing stress hormone work in remote locations. But just to give you a basic setup, these were my three research questions as they boiled down. So for example, do people in more urban environments, so the ones closer to the administrative capital, show evidence of higher physiological stress hormone levels, as many papers in Western literature have shown? How does this relate to our perceived anxiety levels? And is there this relationship between psychological and physical stress, as some studies have found, but it's by no means conclusive? And looking more longer term, what are the effects of things like education and wealth? You need to be very careful here. The concept of wealth in Papua New Guinea is very different. Everything is related to social capital. So just to give you an example of some of the challenges you run into, if I can walk into a village and ask somebody, do you own a bicycle? And they say, yeah, look, the red one over there, that's mine, and this is important for me as an anthropologist, because having access to a bicycle means that they are more mobile, and in a lot of, for example, African studies, it's a good predictor of how the chances of people finding employment and work. Now, this is all very well, but then I go to their neighbor's house, 10-minute walk away, and say, do you own a bicycle, for example? I say, yes, you remember the red one that you saw next to so-and-so's house? That's also my bicycle. Because they have a clan-based structure, whereby as long as you're part of their one talk system, literally one language, you have access to these material goods. And immediately you can see what challenges this raises when doing a classical study of the relationship between demography and wealth, and for example stress hormone levels, and seeing whether they're how much you can compare these to, for example, studies based in Western environments where material wealth is often individualistically owned. But I will get into more specific examples. Measuring the human stress response. I measured cortisol in saliva. There's very good reasons for doing that. I will explain exactly why in a moment. I also took anthropometric measurements, demographic and socioeconomic data, and anxiety questionnaire, which couldn't be the ones that are standardized that we have. And I will go through, after I talk a little bit about my work, some of the options open to you for people looking to do this in the field. But the cultural consonants of things like questionnaires are incredibly important, and you run into a lot of roadblocks in remote populations, especially when considering that among those 3 villages and 67 people in my study, there were 21 different mother tongues. So I can converse in Pidgin English, and a lot of people were able to do that, and where that wasn't possible, I had a translator. But go figure how many standardized questionnaires there are for Papua New Guinea. None is the answer. So you have to create those. I should also mention that the beauty of doing randomization that you can to some extent do in a lab with undergraduate students, which is of course not a random sample, because undergraduate populations across the world are very specific, but also very convenient. There were many times I wished I could just pay some people to come to a lab. The difference was that I was running around in the jungle at all hours by myself with a pair of scales and lots of plastic pots full of spit. I had no money for field assistance, in case you're wondering why did you only get 67 people. And also there were considerations as to where I based myself. The common denominator of all these locations was that somewhere nearby, not always in that village but the next one, there was a propane powered gas refrigerator in which I could store my saliva samples. Freezing turned out to be a good challenge, getting samples back to the UK to the lab. Top tip, go to the local fisheries depot where they fast freeze in those deep fast frying fish places. I asked, is it okay, I can't freeze my samples anywhere else? And they say, yeah, that's fine. I said, I've triple packed them, but freeze them separately, I'll pay you money to do this. Of course, by the time we got back to the lab, one of the joys of unpacking all these samples was the fact that the entire lab smelled of fish because they had been deep frozen with all these fish. Saliva has many advantages. Another one is, and I don't know whether this has changed, I had to go back through Australia. Saliva is known as a grey body fluid. In other words, clearly it can carry disease. It has most of the stuff you have in your blood, but at minuscule concentrations. But people don't quite know what to do with it. So that was very lucky for me, because the Australians ummed and ahed about some of the samples. I wasn't able to send back directly, but did allow it to go through. As soon as you're dealing with blood, this is just simply not an option. I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunities now available with hair. But saliva was a really safe bet for me, not least because with this rise in sexually transmitted diseases in these areas, you really don't want to be in the middle of the jungle at 35 degrees with 82% humidity, where wounds and everything spread like there's no abandon, trying to draw blood from people, because although I could have spent my time more in the more urban health centres, that would mean having a very biased sample of the population, and this is where saliva was a good option. Another thing that you might have to deal with is sorcery and witchcraft. The only reason I was able to get people to give saliva, which is a body fluid like any other, is because the Australians had come in with an anti-tuberculosis campaign about 10 years previously, and people were happy doing that. But hair, blood, saliva, all these things can be used to put spells on people, and they take that very seriously there. So there's no way I would have been able to get these samples otherwise. And it sounds like something trivial, and we might be condescending of it, but actually good luck trying to do research in some of these areas where these TP programs haven't been, because there's no way you'll receive it. Because people are just skeptical, you're an outsider. Being white helped insofar as that they just assumed I was a medical doctor, but that potentially also creates ethical issues that you need to be aware of. And I owe a lot to Professor Joe Herbert, who you'll be hearing from next, with all this advice on saliva. And one of the things he said to me, one day the lab in Cambridge, we shut down power, the saliva samples basically went green, but the corticosteroids, they were stable. And that was music to my ears, because I had no security that I would be able to freeze them all very quickly. And as soon as you deal with blood and urine, you have to freeze them. You don't have that flexibility. But of course, you run into other problems, because I would be speaking about this research and trying to get quantitative and qualitative data, and the social anthropologist would say, yeah, well, this is nice, but how much is the hormone data going to tell you? I had another, no, not Joe, I hasten to add, endocrinologist say to me, well, why are you wasting your time on all these behavioural observations, right? You could collect so many more samples in that time. And between them, trying to say, one of you gives me, I get quantitative data, but I have no context. The other one, I have a subjective context, but no quantitative data. But it becomes messy, and you have got small sample size, and this is something you do open yourself up to criticism from a lot of angles. But when it comes to fieldwork and doing holistic fieldwork, I think this is the only way to go about it, but be really aware of the limitations, which are true. And I mean, a public health official, they are correct. A controlled lab environment will allow you to measure things in some ways more accurately and give you greater flexibility in certain situations. This is just an overview of some of the data I collected. But what I just briefly want to focus on here is that you can check for the reliability of data quite nicely with cortisol, because it's got the circadian rhythm, and you can see that the subjects in this study nicely followed that. And to that extent, humans are pretty much the same everywhere. There wasn't a significant difference between men and women. And we also see this is showing cortisol according to age by waking or the hour afterwards, or evening cortisol. I should mention that's something that I did. So across 4 days, I mentioned cortisol levels in saliva 3 times a day upon waking, an hour afterwards, and 12 hours after that, so that you can take into account the circadian rhythm. So it does require more samples, but it gives you hopefully an accurate baseline. And this is another thing when you're looking to set up interdisciplinary projects that is really worth thinking about. Because, for example, talking to some of my colleagues who look at ritual and do some of the religious studies, what they might do is take a cortisol measure during a religious ritual and then take one at the same time on a different day, and just compare the difference. Now, within a lot of the endocrinology journals, that would not be considered a viable enough baseline, because the variability in something like cortisol is really high. But depending on the discipline and depending on the papers, you can see quite a lot of different methodologies. So my advice would be is, if you're working on an interdisciplinary project, really have a look at where do you want to be publishing and what standards are required. I'm not necessarily, I have raging arguments about this with different people as to what is the acceptable quality of data. And some, some of the people in the religious studies will say, well, no, actually, just the difference between those two, that's fine. That's been accepted in publication, and it's not feasible to get a baseline of hundreds of people at a religious ceremony, which is also true. So think about how you're using those data and what they actually mean. I mean, and just to give an example how this can work out nicely, Lemmerkop was my most urban location, Bol was my most traditional village, and in this case, even in a relatively small sample size, you can see that physiologically there was already this effect of increased urbanization across these different populations. I'm more than happy to talk about, this is just a snapshot of a couple of results from this study, I'm more than happy to talk about the conclusions afterwards. But I just want to, or come and find me, talk to me, there's a lot more here, but I would like to just leave you with a couple of tips of different things that you can measure and some of the considerations you want to take. When it comes to cortisol and saliva, you've got to decide, are we doing cross-sectional or longitudinal study? There's been quite a lot of well-established longitudinal programs, and they will provide more secure data. Language is key. Think about perceived stress and anxiety questionnaires. In Papua New Guinea, for example, the term stress, they understand it, but it's not what they use. So the term they use is varies, which literally comes from the English worries. So what I did to construct my anxiety questionnaire is did dozens and dozens of open-ended interviews first, and later narrowed that down to what seemed to be essential issues within these communities. It's not a perfect way of doing it, and I wasn't able to have outside validation, but it would have been nonsensical to take a Western scale, where, for example, the Holmes and Rahe scale is a nice example. Have you recently lost your job? Well, for somebody who's a subsistence agriculturalist, that's completely meaningless and doesn't easily translate. The other big challenge, if people working in the Pacific, betel nut chewing, great stuff. It means you don't get any caries because it increases the pH of your mouth to such an acidic level that all the bacteria die. Not so good for periodontal disease and cancers, but you don't get like caries, or what do you call them? Holes in teeth. The problem was that I had no way of testing the effect of this on the saliva and whether the corticosteroids would be intact. Obviously I could tell people not to chew, but again, I couldn't ban them from that because 90% of your sample is chewing this stuff. All these things worth thinking about. I've mentioned the problems with questionnaires. I've gone through some of the cultural dimensions. I just want to give you a snapshot of a few of the anxiety questionnaires that we've got, but mostly want to end on the new methods and opportunities, and that's cortisol and hair. I've mentioned most of these. There are different ways to measure sociocultural stressors. coping resources and looking at personalities also increasingly popular as these skills are getting better. But again, think about what you're trying to measure. Something that I would like to talk more about this afternoon for people that are interested is this idea of cultural consonance and how much people fit within their communities and how well this actually predicts some of the blood pressure measurements, for example, and some of the cortisol measures. But I don't have time to go into that now, but I will come back to that hopefully in discussions this afternoon. Talking about creating culturally specific skills, this is a science in itself. Come and talk to me if this is something that you're tackling or you're working with different people and different populations and need to do this. Sympathetic nervous system measurements, the catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, slightly on the down in terms of how much that is used these days. The urinary ones tend to be used most, but that's limited by the fact that it needs to be frozen. And there's some storage issues there if you're working in remote field conditions. I've talked about saliva being the preferred method for fieldwork situations, but you've got to consider some of the limitations. The HPA axis is better for the longer chronic measurement of stress, and that's why I chose it, because I wanted to get that measurement in Papua New Guinea. I wasn't looking for an immediate result. And just finally, something I haven't used myself but I'm really excited about is the opportunities of measuring cortisol in hair. And the reason this is exciting is that, like saliva, it's even arguably less invasive, easy to transport. You don't have a lot of the headaches that come with saliva or blood. And basically the way this works is that it seems there's various mechanisms, whether it's blood, sebum or sweat, but cortisol does move into hair. And the growth rate of hair is predictable, and as such, up to a certain amount, so it's about 5 centimeters from the skull, you can potentially measure stress or chronic stress in hair. And this would be particularly interesting in populations, for example, that have experienced sudden earthquakes or disasters like that, and then looking at the follow-up of this chronic stress. The only other consideration that you really do need to keep in mind here is that there's a slight variation between different ethnic groups. So people with curly African-style hair, for example, there's slightly different measurements to people with blonde Caucasian hair. But other than that, there's lots of really exciting results coming through from that. Anybody interested in potentially looking at that or collaborating, it's something that I would like to test in various populations. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for your time, and happy to take just 1 or 2 questions since we're running a little bit late.
I'm glad to hear that you had the interviews, the open interviews, because like you said, taking a Western model of doing investigation into that setting not only represents challenges, but it may not be the best. So traditionally you've had these open interviews. How do you switch from one to the other? Do you see them as totally different, or does one inform the other?
So the open interviews, I would basically start really general with people, tell me about your life, what do you love, what do you find frustrating, and then try out different words, look at the responses I get. And then when they talk about, in Pidgin English, for example, there's a term about having a tightness in your belly and literally, that stress. And then pick up on the terms that they were throwing out to me, and I would ask, what do these mean to you? And then the translation to the more pointed questionnaires might be, for example, how often do you find this tightness in your belly? That would be a very locally accepted term. And the problem is, those questionnaires are only comparable within the people within this study. And that's the big limitation, because although it's now a culturally accurate and relevant scale, it is almost impossible to compare it to studies done elsewhere. And I mean, there are a few scales which have been coming out which culturally are more general, but I haven't found a good solution. I'm still struggling to find a good way to do perceived anxiety questionnaires cross-culturally that are meaningful. Really, Lars?
I'm just wondering if this, you mentioned cortisol in hair,
Yeah.
if that can meet some of the challenges with cortisol levels fluctuating in diurnal rhythm.
Yeah, so I mean, it's it means you have one sample and that's pretty much all you need. But the point is, it's an average of chronic stress. So also it won't show up smaller fluctuations. So if, for example, you were looking to record a major cultural event, you wouldn't have the specificity of different days because we don't have that resolution. The hair would be great if, and they've done it, for example, with polar bear hair, to look at different parts of different centuries when they're being hunted versus when they're not being hunted. And you can do that in ancient populations and modern populations and see this nice comparison. The problem with it is because it is chronic stress, if you're trying to look at subtle individual differences within two different groups in a population, you probably wouldn't see that. Suresh, yeah.
So what do you want to do with this kind of information? Do you want to make some recommendations on what
Yeah.
doses, or sell them pills?
No, and so this is, I mean, that's a really good question. It's something I meant to come back to, and something I would love to discuss with practitioners in the field. One of my frustrations with this work, although I love doing the science and it was from an anthropological angle super interesting, is I felt like I was somewhat powerless to suggest ways for people to tackle, because there was a huge amount of stress that was measured there and high levels of anxiety in different groups. But I felt somewhat powerless to recommend practical medical potentially interventions, be that mindfulness or cognitive behavioral therapy, and how much you would be able to do that in a developing country where the resources aren't there. But that was the bit that was missing for me, and I think one thing that I'm increasingly interested in is working with practitioners so that we get some really good anthropology, good science, fantastic data that builds up stress profiles in different populations, but how do we also have some mitigating influence and we benefit the populations that work with and give useful practical advice that they can, giving them pills that's, it's a non-starter in Papua New Guinea. Yeah, any other questions any other thoughts? Has anybody else experienced this challenge of working cross-culturally with these measures and found good solutions?
In population studies, what is the most healthy population in terms of cortisol level?
And there's the other biggest problem is that the variation in cortisol is so high. I mean, the Papua New Guinea populations, they're incredibly healthy in many ways, because despite the fact that from the outside, if you look at the amount of alcoholism, suicide, rape and abuse in those cultures, it is absolutely staggering. So the level of admitted domestic violence is 71%, but people seem
I have no signal. Why is that? I wonder.
Hang on, I can tell you.
There's that one. That's it.
There you go.
Thanks, all right.
So yeah, no, they do quite well.